הולכת להכין כושרי, שזה אוכל מצרי, שהוא בעצם אורז פסטה ועדשים שחורים עם שני רטבים, רוטב של עגבניות ורוטב של שום חריף. המנה הזאת היא מנה מצרית. המשפחה שלי באה ממצרים, מאל-פיום, ואני, סלמה פיומי, באה מאל-פיום.
عجزت مصر أن تمد قطاع غزة ب2 مليون أو 1.5 مليون من الوقود. يا أخوانا احنا عددنا في غزة 1,800,000، عدد مصر حوالي 90 مليون. يعني لو تيجي احنا قديش النسبة؟ نسبة بسيطة جدا، تقريبا 2%. 2%، يعني لا نشكل عليكم ضغط مطلقا. الأقصى وأهل فلسطين يمثلون رأس حربة للإسلام والمسلمين، ولذلك عندما نستنجد بإخواننا العرب لا نستنجد لنأكل ولنعيش ولنشرب ولنلبس ولنترفه، لا، عندما نستنجد إنما نستنجد لنواصل الجهاد. والحمد لله أصولنا كلنا عربية، ويستطيع كل فلسطيني في غزة وفي كل فلسطين أن يأتي بجذوره العربية، سواء كانت من السعودية أو من اليمن أو من أي نفط، ولذلك قد تربطنا قرابات. ولذلك أين المودة؟ أين الرحمة؟ أنا شخصيا نص عائلتي مصرية كلنا، ويمكن بيجي حوالي أكثر من 30 عائلة اسمها المصري. في أساسنا نص فلسطين يا أخواننا مصري ونصها سعودي. إيش من هم الفلسطينيون؟
We often hear these historical claims about the Palestinians.
منذ 5000 سنة والفلسطينيون في هذه الأرض.
سيدنا المسيح عليه السلام هو فلسطيني بامتياز.
In a highly politicized debate, it's worth asking, what's fact and what's fiction? Early versions of the name Palestine refer to a small region on the Mediterranean coast bordering Egypt and to the Philistines, an ancient Greek people that, like many others, had vanished over time and have no connection to today's Palestinians. The word Palestine was first formally used by the Roman Emperor Hadrian. During his rule, Hadrian massacred the rebellious Jewish population in the Kingdom of Judea and sent most of the remaining Jewish population into exile. Hadrian was determined to obliterate thousands of years of Jewish presence in the land that is documented with extensive archaeological findings and place names we still use today. And so, he decided to rename the province of Judea, Syria, Palestina, after the vanished nemesis of the ancient Jews, the Philistines. Judea was the last independent state that existed in the land. Century after century, the remaining Jews, as well as other groups, lived under the rule of successive foreign powers. During the time of the Ottoman Empire, the word Palestine was used as a general geographical term describing the land south of Syria. So when that area fell into the hands of the British at the end of World War I, it was only natural that they named it Palestine. The League of Nations, a predecessor to the UN, granted the victorious World War I powers mandates to control the Middle East and prepare the local peoples for independence. This area came under the British Mandate of Palestine. Two populations lived under the Mandate of Palestine, Arab and Jewish, both of them considered Palestinians. And so, the Jewish-founded Palestine Symphony Orchestra would, upon Israel's independence, become the Israeli Philharmonic. The Anglo-Palestine Bank would become the Israeli Leumi Bank. And this poster, that is often used today to support anti-Israel arguments, was in fact a Zionist ad promoting tourism to the Jewish homeland in Palestine. In 1947, the mandate expired, and the UN decided to split the land into independent Jewish and Arab states. The Jews accepted the UN resolution and called their state Israel. The Arab world, however, rejected the two-state plan, and right after the last British soldiers departed, attacked their newly independent neighbor. After the war, Jordan annexed the West Bank, and Egypt took over the Gaza Strip, which were both assigned to the Arabs as part of the partition plan. Neither country saw a need to set up an independent state in these areas. As a result, an Arab state did not materialize in the former British Mandate of Palestine. Palestinian identity continued to grow after 1948, culminating in 1964 when the Arab League initiated the creation of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, declaring this Arab group the Palestinian people. The PLO demanded the entire area of the mandate, though it called for the destruction of Israel, but did not challenge Jordanian and Egyptian rule. Arab aspirations continued to focus solely on eliminating the State of Israel, instigating another war in 1967, in which Israel gained control over the former mandate territories in the West Bank and Gaza. So, are these historical claims about the Palestinians true?
لم تمر حقبة في التاريخ خلت من وجود الشعب الفلسطيني في هذه الأرض.
السيد المسيح كان الفلسطيني الأول الذي عذب في هذه الأرض.
No, these claims are false. Jesus was born 134 years before the Romans changed the name of Judea to Palestine, over 1900 years before it became the name of the British Mandate, and almost 2,000 years before it was widely adopted by an Arab population in the region. He was, however, a Jew, living in the Kingdom of Judea. All history put aside, Israel and the international community have endorsed Palestinian national aspirations through repeated peace offers based on a two-state solution. Unfortunately for everyone in the region, Palestinian and Arab leaders have rejected all of these offers. They continue to make false historical claims, hoping to erase Jewish ties and deny Jewish rights in this region.
Back in 2011, Newt Gingrich made headlines when he said that the Palestinians were an invented people.
I remember there was no Palestine as a state. part of the Ottoman Empire. And I think that we've had an invented Palestinian people who are in fact Arabs.
Speaker Gingrich was condemned for those comments, as they were perceived as mean-spirited, but as Ben Shapiro likes to say, facts don't care about your feelings. So what are the facts? Let's go back to November 29th, 1947. The United Nations approves what was called the Plan of Partition. In 1917, just after World War II, Great Britain, which now controlled historic Palestine, an area that comprised all of modern-day Israel and Jordan, released the Balfour Declaration, which promised to create a Jewish homeland in the region, recognizing that this was the ancient birthplace of the Jewish people. In 1922, Great Britain stabbed the Jewish people in the back and gave 80% of that land to the Arabs, creating the brand new nation of Jordan, adding to the plethora of Arab states that already existed. Okay, back to 1947. The UN agrees to take the remaining 20% of Palestine, recently relinquished to the UN by Great Britain, and partition this land into two more nations. One for a Jewish state, yay, and one for another Arab state. So 90% of the land that was promised to the Jewish people would now have two brand new Arab states. It's key to understand that never did anyone use the term Palestinian state to refer to the proposed new Arab country. That is because there was no such thing as a Palestinian national identity. Gingrich was absolutely correct. There had never been a Palestinian nation, nor was there any distinct Palestinian Arab culture. The only difference between the Arabs living in Jordan and the Arabs living in what would be the new Arab state was that one group lived on the west side of the Jordan River and the other on the east. Ethnically, they are the same people. Furthermore, at the time of the passing of the partition plan, do you know what the name of the Jewish-owned newspaper was? The paper that would one day be called the Jerusalem Post? It was called the Palestine Post. Now, why in the world would a Jewish-owned newspaper take on an Arab ethnic name? Well, the answer is they would not. At the time, the word Palestine or Palestinian had zero connection to any ethnic people. It was simply the nickname of the region, and this nickname was given 100 years after the time of Jesus, a long time ago, when the Romans conquered Judea and sought to cleanse the land of its Jewishness. They expelled the Jewish population and changed the name from Judea to Philistia, or Palestine, after the ancient Philistines. Okay, getting back to partition. The Jews agreed to it, but the Arabs rejected it. We could have peace today if the Arabs would have been happy with 90% of historic Palestine, leaving the Jews with just 10% of the Promised Land. So when did the Arabs who lived on the west side of the Jordan begin to call themselves Palestinians? I will tell you in part 2. Shalom everyone from Israel. In our last video, we examined the claim by former U.S. House Speaker Newt Gingrich that the Palestinians were an invented people, and we concluded that he was right. Arabs who lived in this region of the Middle East did not use the word Palestinian to define themselves. So just when did they start identifying as Palestinians? I'll let you know in just a minute. In the 1920s, the British took control of what they called Palestine, formerly part of the Ottoman Empire. The Arabs of the region rejected the name Palestinian because it seemed to be, to them, amazingly enough, too Jewish or connected to the Crusades. They swore their allegiance to Syria and considered Palestine actually southern Syria. This is a fact. In 1939, one Palestinian leader said, "There is no such country as Palestine. Palestine is a term that the Zionists invented. There is no Palestine in the Bible. Our country was for centuries part of Syria." And even as the Palestinian Arab narrative began to develop, or be created, in 1976, Syrian President Hafez al-Assad sought to remind the leaders of the PLO that Palestine was really southern Syria, and they should represent the Arabs living there. Quote, "Do not forget one thing, there is no Palestinian people, no Palestinian entity, there is only Syria." Now back to the 1920s. At that time, there were only 500,000 Arabs living in the region. Joseph Farah, an Arab Christian journalist, writes, "The Arab population of Palestine was historically extremely low, prior to the Jews' renewed interest in the area beginning in the 1900s. Mark Twain referred to Palestine as a desolate country that is given over wholly to weeds. He goes on to say that he never saw a human being." Shira Sokuram writes, "The return of the Jewish people was accompanied by economic prosperity for the region, and Arabs migrated to enjoy the higher standard of living. By 1948, there were more than 1.3 million Arabs in the region. The Arab population had nearly tripled in 30 years. That means around 2/3 of those who called themselves Palestinian actually came from other countries after 1919. But now, if you listen to the Palestinians explain their history, you get an assortment of myths ranging from, we are from the ancient Philistines, or we're connected to the ancient Canaanites, to Jesus was a Palestinian. Palestinian theologian Saim Atik asserts Jesus of Nazareth was also a Palestinian living under occupation. Scottish minister Alistair Black, in a Christmas message, referred to the Jewish Messiah in Bethlehem because of a census as a Palestinian refugee under occupation.
And this is the hope of Christmas, that the birth of another Palestinian child, who was born a refugee and subject to military oppression, brought.
Quoting from Israel Hayom, the noted scholar of nationalist movements Anthony Smith once made a differentiation between two kinds of methods in constructing a national identity. The first method is determining a national grouping on the basis of a shared culture in history. The second method is used by nations who do not have such a shared common history and thus need to invent it all from scratch. And that, my friends, was the genius of Arafat. Because of him, your average Joe assumes that 1. There was once a nation called Palestine. False. 2. The Jews took it from them in 1948 to create Israel. Also false. And 3. The Palestinian Arab people have been settling in modern-day Israel for thousands of years. Again, false. In part 3, we will give further proof that the Palestinian narrative was invented, and it's going to blow your mind. Welcome to part 3 in our little series about the invention of the Palestinian narrative. In this clip, I want to share with you why the narrative was created. In truth, most Arabs living in Israel or the territories, not all, can trace their roots back to Egypt, Jordan, Syria, or some other Arab country. In fact, Yasser Arafat himself was an Egyptian, not a Palestinian. A former PLO member, now a Christian, has stated everyone he met in Palestine, quote, knew to trace the roots of their families to their country from which their great-grandfathers came. We knew full well that our origin was not Canaanite, despite that's what they tried to teach us. My grandfather would often remind us that our village, Beit Saul, near Bethlehem, was empty when his father arrived there with 6 other families. Today, there are over 30,000 residents in that village. Even in 1967, the idea of a Palestinian Arab nation was foreign to most who now call themselves Palestinian. Before the Six-Day War, they were called Jordanian. Shira Sokuram writes, "When I moved to Israel in 1967, after the Six-Day War, I had numerous conversations with Arabs living in both Israel proper and on the West Bank. I didn't even hear the term Palestinian from any Arabs at the time." One prominent PLO leader in the 1970s said, quote, "The Palestinian people does not exist. The creation of a Palestinian state is only a means for continuing our struggle against the state of Israel. In reality, today there is no difference between Jordanians, Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese. Only for political and tactical reasons do we speak today about the existence of a Palestinian people, since Arab national interests demand that we posit the existence of a distinct Palestinian people to oppose Zionism." Writer David Meir Levy claims Arafat himself said the same thing on many occasions. In his authorized biography, he is quoted as saying, "The Palestinian people have no national identity. I, Yasser Arafat, man of destiny, will give them that identity through conflict with Israel." In 1964, Arafat gets some advice from a Vietnam general that would take years to implement. He sent a top aide to Vietnam to study their methods. How had they, a brutal communist regime, won the sympathy of left-wing Europeans and college students in America? It was simple, quote, "Stop talking about annihilating Israel and instead turn your terror war into a struggle for human rights. Then you will have the American people eating out of your hand." No longer was he going to be seen as a murdering terrorist, but a freedom fighter fighting against Israel's illegal occupation for the invented Palestinian nation. Mohammed Yazid, the former information minister from Algeria, reinforced this notion. After the Israeli victory in the Six-Day War, he told Arafat, quote, "Wipe out the argument that Israel is a small state whose existence is threatened by the Arab states, or the reduction of the Palestinian problem to a question of refugees. Instead, present the Palestinian struggle as a struggle for liberation. Wipe out the impression that in the struggle between the Palestinians and the Zionist is the underdog. Now it is the Arab which is oppressed and victimized in his existence because he is not only facing the Zionists but also world imperialism." According to Meir Levy, the KGB discipled Arafat and made sure he followed the plan. Arafat resisted this idea in the beginning. He just wanted to destroy Israel, but over time he bought in. Yes, that bit of advice got him into the Rose Garden at the White House. Okay, let's summarize. Before Arafat, there was no national Palestinian identity. In fact, many Arabs saw the word Palestine as something from the maps of the English Bibles. The overwhelming majority of Arabs living in Israel today immigrated within the last 100 years. They have no long history in the region. Arafat created the Palestinian national identity for the purpose of presenting Israel as an oppressor and to promote his war against Israel, not for the West Bank or Gaza, but to conquer all of Israel. And it has worked. Just go to any college campus in the U.S. and you are bound to see some form of protest against Israel. Calls for boycott. It's hard to believe, but Arafat, a man who died with a personal net worth of $1 billion, sold the world that he was a poor, oppressed freedom fighter.
On November 20th, just 3 months after Hitler invades the Soviet Union, the Grand Mufti Amin al-Husseini is in Berlin, safe from British pursuit. He is welcomed to the Nazi capital by the German Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop. The Mufti failed in Iraq, but he is convinced that a Nazi victory in the war will, in the end, give him everything he wants. Once again, he asks von Ribbentrop for German promises to support Arab independence. He insists that the Jews of the Middle East are part of a world conspiracy and makes it clear that he fully supports their complete annihilation. He asks von Ribbentrop for FaceTime with Adolf Hitler. Von Ribbentrop is impressed. He agrees that the Mufti should meet Hitler in person.
The Grand Mufti wanted Hitler to promise an Arab national state in the Middle East, in the ancient lands of Islam. And that's exactly what Hitler was willing to offer them, either quietly or openly, depending upon the nature of the context.
8 days after he is greeted in Berlin by von Ribbentrop, the Grand Mufti has his long sought-after meeting with Adolf Hitler.
Hitler explained to him that he would ask every people in the Middle East to deal with their Jews and to solve the Jewish problem. And it was clear what he meant. He meant to organize another Holocaust in the Middle East.
With Hitler's blessing, the Grand Mufti is introduced to the chief of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. Himmler, his subordinate Adolf Eichmann, and al-Husseini become close friends. Himmler gives the Mufti the rank of Gruppenführer in the SS, the equivalent of general, and gives Amin and his followers a generous monthly allowance to set up an Arab bureau in Berlin.
The Mufti was everywhere in Germany during World War II. He was parading up and down the street. He was making official visits. He was making embassy visits. He was on Radio Berlin nightly.
Himmler puts the Mufti in charge of all Arabic broadcasting from Berlin. Over the airwaves, al-Husseini repeatedly calls for another Arab uprising against the British. He also rails against the Jews, inciting Arabs to, quote, kill the Jews wherever you find them.
In all of his speeches afterwards, he would always exclaim, there are three big enemies: the British, the Americans, and the Jews. He would depict America as the big enemy of the Arabs.
The Mufti hated Jews. He hated Zionism. His goal was to destroy the Jews, kill them before they were allowed to immigrate.
In 1943, the Grand Mufti learns of plans by Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, countries allied to Germany, to let thousands of Jews leave for the safety of Palestine. Through his influence with Himmler and von Ribbentrop, the Mufti immediately has the programs canceled. Among the planned emigrants are 4,000 children. Their fate in Nazi-controlled Europe is almost certain death. In the last 4 years of war, Germany has suffered enormous casualties on the battlefield. The Reich is desperate for fighting men. Heinrich Himmler begins recruiting Muslims from the Balkans with the enthusiastic help of the Grand Mufti, Amin al-Husseini. The Mufti helps raise the Bosnian Muslim 13th SS Division Hansjar, along with other units of what the Mufti calls his Arab Legion. Altogether, the Grand Mufti helps recruit 30,000 men for the Nazi war machine. Ironically, in Nazi racial theory, Arabs are seen as inferior racial stock and not eligible for SS membership. Himmler treats foreign SS units with contempt as second-class citizens. But after an extensive physical exam for the Mufti, he makes an exception. For this, he has Hitler's approval.
The personal physician of the Grand Mufti evaluated the Grand Mufti, and he said he is not an Arab. He's a Caucasian, almost an Aryan. So we can expect that he will be a really reliable ally for us.
The SS Division Hansjar is deployed hunting down underground resistors in Yugoslavia and acts as an internal security force in Hungary. The division is responsible for a series of atrocities against partisans and Jews. In April 1945, as Allied troops fight their way through Germany in the last battles of the war in Europe, the story of the Mufti's Muslim regiments takes one final twist. As the cataclysmic battle for Berlin rages around Hitler's bunker, among the Nazi troops making their last suicidal stand are 100 men of the Mufti's Arab Legion. With the Allied victory, the war is over. But the influence of Nazi Germany on the Middle East is far from over. In Iraq, the Grand Mufti's legacy will fan the flames of a new and potent force, one that will mold a young Arab nationalist into a cunning and brutal dictator.
I believe that we are living in a time when there's a great paradox. A paradox because the state of Israel and its continuing Middle East conflict with the Muslim people continues to dominate world affairs. It dominates most of the UN debate. It dominates a great deal of the media. And I believe it all is because the media has swallowed a myth, a monstrous lie that has come to be accepted as truth. Probably the most important part of this lie is the myth. Jews stole Palestinian cities, land, and houses. This is a falsehood taught to Palestinians and many Arab children from infancy. This is an excerpt from one of the Arabic 12th grade textbooks. Palestine's 1948 war ended with a catastrophe, or Nakba as they call it, that is unprecedented in history when the Zionist gang stole Palestine and expelled its people from their cities, their villages, their lands, and their houses, and established the state of Israel. These claims are false. Here are the facts. There was no Arab state or nation called Palestine in the Middle East in 1948 or ever. That means there was no Palestinian nation that the Jews could steal or occupy. Let's look at some of history. The Ottoman Turks ruled the entire area from 1517 to 1917. During that time, there were no nations or independent states within the empire, just provinces. The locations of the future states of Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, and others were created by the European powers at the end of the First World War out of the ruins of the Turkish Empire. A homeland for Israel was one of the first created by the League of Nations. The fact is, the Jews have lived continuously in Palestine for 3,700 years. Since the 19th century, the Jews were a majority of the population in Jerusalem. Therefore, since Israel's claim is older than any other, and its people have inhabited the land longer than any others, Israel has as much right to exist in the Middle East as do any of these Arab states. Jews are the most persecuted people on earth. They were victims of the ruthless Russian pogroms and other Eastern European persecutions. The Nazis attempted to eliminate the entire Jewish race. More than 6 million men, women, and children were murdered in cold blood. Haj Amin al-Husseini, the leader of what we now know as the Palestinians, was in full cooperation with Adolf Hitler in his final solution plan for the Jewish people. They almost succeeded. You know, it's interesting that in this great attempt, many of those Jews could have been saved if other nations in the West would have accepted them to immigrate. At the San Remo conference in 1922, the League of Nations gave Britain the mandate to create a home for the Jews. A substantial portion of the land encompassing modern Jordan and Israel at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea was designated as the Palestine Mandate. It was to be a final secure homeland for the Jewish people. But the Arabs benefited most from the mandate, it turns out. In 1922, as British colonial secretary, Winston Churchill gave Transjordan to the Hashemites. Now let me explain this for a minute. The Hashemites were the guardians and custodians of the holy places, Mecca and Medina, for many centuries. They helped somewhat in the war effort in World War I. And so when they appealed to Churchill's department that they should be rewarded as helpers by giving a home, he then appealed to give Transjordan to them. The Hashemites, whom we know now as the Jordanians, were driven from their position as the guardians of the holy sites by the Saudis. Jewish leader Chaim Weizmann agreed to give 80% of the Jews' Palestine Mandate land to the Hashemites. This was in exchange where the Jews received a written agreement that Transjordan would be made a home for those displaced Arabs that lived in Palestine Mandate territory. The agreement was signed by Emir Faisal, representing the Arab kingdom of the Hejaz, or the holy sites around the great territory of Mecca and Medina. In this document, Emir Faisal promised there would be no more demands upon the Jews by the Arabs if they were given this land. Today, the Kingdom of Jordan, which is at least 83% Palestinian, is supposed to be the Palestinian state, but it is not acceptable. The Hashemites took over Transjordan and rule it. Why? Because there was never a national entity of people known as Palestinians. In response to continuous Arab threats and terror, in 1947, the United Nations divided the remaining 20% of the original mandate into what is called today the Gaza Strip and the West Bank for the Muslims. It allowed the Jews to keep an indefensible sliver of land as their home. 60% of the land that was allotted to the Jews was an wasteland, but they went to work and made the desert bloom. What did the Muslims do with the West Bank and Gaza? They were given billions of dollars from the United States, the United Nations, and Europe and their Jewish neighbors. And this was for economic development. But virtually all of it was taken by the PLO and other terrorist organizations that used the money for weapons and terror attacks. The rest went to Swiss bank accounts of the corrupt Palestinian leadership. No infrastructure for a state has ever been built.
For the first time in 2,000 years, Jews had a state of their own. Though it represented only 1/6 of 1% of the Middle East, that was unacceptable to the Muslims. Instead, Hassan al-Banna, founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, said in 1948, "If the Jewish state becomes a fact, the Arabs will drive the Jews who live in their midst into the sea." When the Jews had virtually no land, the Muslims vowed to destroy them and drive them into the sea. So why should they believe the Arabs will not seek to destroy the remainder of the present-day Israel if they give them back the same land they had in 1948? The Middle East war is not about land. The Muslims justify their war against Israel by saying the Jews stole their land and then occupied it. The facts prove these claims to be false. On May 15, 1948, the day after Israel declared statehood, 5 surrounding Arab nations simultaneously attacked the infant nation. The attacking Arab governments urged the Arabs in the new nation of Israel to flee their homes. They promised to butcher the Jews in a few weeks. Then the refugees could return to their homes and claim the booty that was left. But the surrounding governments failed to make good on their promise. Against all odds, the Jews held them off. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, wrote, "The Arab armies entered Palestine to protect the Palestinians from the Zionist tyranny, but instead they abandoned them, forced them to immigrate and to leave their homeland, imposed upon them political and ideological blockade, and threw them into prison similar to the ghettos in which the Jews used to live in Eastern Europe." The ironic fact is that almost 1 million Arabs remained and did not leave. Today, these Arabs have more freedom as full Israeli citizens than their fellow Arabs in any Muslim country. If, as Jimmy Carter and his liberal cohorts claim, the Jews are ruthless occupiers and thieves, then why do the Israeli Arabs have more rights than Arabs in the Muslim states? Abbas's statement brings out a grossly ignored fact. The Muslims are more barbaric to each other than any other people. They have treated the Palestinian refugees more ruthlessly than Israel ever has. For the most part, they have refused to accept them and give them full citizenship. They have deliberately kept them in concentration camps in order to fan their fires of hatred toward the Jews. Back in the 70s, Jordan's King Hussein stopped the Palestinian revolt by turning artillery on Palestinian refugee camps filled with women and children, much the same as happened in Lebanon just a month or so ago. It was called the Black September event. Remember the barbarity of Saddam Hussein toward Iran in their nearly 10-year war. He used chemical weapons against them. And the Ayatollah Khomeini sent young boys into minefields to clear the way for his troops in a battle against Iraq. The Muslim world conveniently sweeps these things under the table. It's only the alleged Jewish mistreatment that they feature to the media. It's transparently done for propaganda purposes to win Western support for their cause. And the liberal Western media buys it hook, line, and sinker. The Middle East war is not about refugees. When Israel became a state in 1948, 850,000 Jews were forced to flee Muslim countries with only the clothes on their backs. Many of these Jews were from communities that had existed for thousands of years. But you never hear about the Jews' refugee problem because the Israelis resettled them in Israel. In contrast, the Muslims put their displaced fellow Arabs into concentration camps and to this day have never accepted them, assimilated them, or offered them citizenship. Yet Israel extended full citizenship to the Arabs who stayed, and the Jews are not welcome in most Muslim countries today. The Palestinian cause is not about self-determination. Muslims and the useful idiots of the West claim that the Middle East is a constant conflict because the Palestinians yearn for a state and Israel refuses to give it to them. Both of these claims are false. The Palestinians were offered statehood in 1948 and again in 2000. Both times they responded with armed aggression and terrorist attacks. From 1948 to 1967, Egypt possessed Gaza and Jordan possessed the West Bank. Why did they not offer that land to their fellow Arabs and Palestinians as a state? It's the same land they now want Israel to give them. Perhaps the Egyptians and the Jordanians know something we don't. The Middle East crisis is really about the annihilation of Israel and the Jews. According to the Muslim propaganda machine, the cause of the Middle East conflict is the Israeli occupation of Arab land. This, too, is false. In 2000, Israel withdrew in force from the southern Lebanon, which they had occupied to stop terrorist rocket attacks on Israeli towns in the north. Hezbollah and Hamas immediately began launching missiles supplied by Iran against Israeli civilians in the northern Israel. In 2005, Israel withdrew its military forces from Gaza, which they had occupied to prevent terrorist attacks. As soon as Israel withdrew and forcibly removed the Jewish settlements, Hamas began launching rockets against towns and schools inside southern Israel. But these terrorists were not a rogue element. They are members of Hamas. And the vast majority of Palestinians voted for Hamas in the last general election and gave them control of the Palestinian government. Surveys show they would do it again. If the Palestinians have immediately and relentlessly attacked Israel both from Lebanon and Gaza when the Israelis gave them that land to them, why do we think they will not do the same when Israel gives them the West Bank and the Golan Heights? The Muslims openly declared their goal. Why do we not listen and believe them? At the World Without Zionism conference in 2005, Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad declared, as the Imam, meaning the Ayatollah Khomeini, said, Israel must be wiped off the map. The Islamic community will not allow its historic enemy to live in the heartland. Anyone who signs a treaty which recognizes the entity of Israel means that he has signed the surrender of the Muslim world. At a later public conference, he said, like it or not, the Zionist regime is headed toward annihilation. The Zionist regime is a rotten, dried tree that will be eliminated by one storm. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah is even more blunt. At various times he has said, the Jews are a cancer which is liable to spread again at any moment. There's no solution to the conflict except with the disappearance of Israel. If they all gather in Israel, it will save us the trouble of going after them worldwide. Folks, all of this is fitting into the exact predictions about the reborn state of Israel in the last days. When I return, I'll share with you what the Bible tells us about this unreal and irrational hatred toward the nation of Israel.
The idea that the radical Muslims have and that Nazis had is they demonize the Jews. You know, they just turn them into demons. And I mean, this is exactly what happened in Germany. Now, can you imagine? We were enlightened people and we fell for this. Why wouldn't Muslims fall for this?
فاليهود هم اليهود هؤلاء هم الذين يجب أن يذبحوا ويجب أن يقتلوا.
They are killing the infidels just like the preacher in the mosque told them to do. It's their duty to kill them.
تا اسرائیل از صحنه روزگار حذف نشود، این فریادها به قوت خود باقی.
I watched anti-Semitism since I was a young kid, and now the world is reaping. These eggs are hatching, and what's coming out is literally something that comes out of Nazi Germany. Same as in Nazi Germany, the Boy Scouts in Nazi Germany, we had the youth. The youth was being robbed from being youth.
I think the worst form of child abuse is teaching a child to hate. What we have on Palestinian TV and on Saudi TV over and over again are little kids being taught songs, I want to be a suicide bomber.
And the youth who are listening to this day and night, what do you expect to happen?
A Palestinian teenager showed up at a crowded West Bank checkpoint wearing a suicide bomb vest. Soldiers sent a yellow robot to hand scissors to the boy so he could cut off the vest. Once the boy was out of harm's way, the bomb vest was detonated.
And I think this is a crime that the Muslim world commits against its children. Hitler committed a crime against young Germans. Took me a long time to see that. But what the Muslims do to their own children is even worse.
They tell Arab children that Jews bake cookies with their blood.
منيح. اصلا نحن في عندنا مهمة للقيادة ولازم ننفذها بسرعة. ايه؟ شو هي؟
This is a scene from the television series Al-Shatat. It was broadcast on satellite TV stations that reach hundreds of millions of viewers.
اسمع، بدنا دم طفل مسيحي قبل الفصح مشان الفطير. شالوه هذا شافكم؟ لا. متأكد؟ طبعا. معناتها خلينا نبدأ فورا.
مدام انتوا على البيت.
تكرم حبيبي بعد شوي بنروح.
Throughout the Middle Ages, there was this libel that the Jews needed blood of a Christian child to make matzah. Now, of course, today the world knows this is totally libelous accusation, no connection to truth at all. Yet the Al-Shatat film was able to include a video depiction of this ancient blood libel as if this is real Jewish ideology.
There is no shame in Arab media. In the degree they are ready to cover hate speech and lies, outright lies against the Western Israel.
التي تصنع الفطير من دم الأطفال الأبرياء.
This is a war of propaganda in which the same techniques of subversion that we saw earlier in the challenge posed by fascism and Nazism are repeating themselves.
The propaganda of Islam is very similar to the propaganda of Nazism. It's the same hate speech, paranoia, and us against them.
لا تقوم الساعة حتى يقاتل المسلمون اليهود فيقتلهم المسلمون، حتى يقول الحجر والشجر يا مسلم يا عبد الله هذا يهودي ورائي فاقتل، ونذكر أمتنا العربية والإسلامية قادة وشعوبا مفكرين وطلابا نذكرهم بأن فلسطين وأن المسجد الأقصى لا يحرر عبر المؤتمرات ولا عبر القرارات الدولية، ولكنه يحرر عبر البندقية، لن يحرر عبر المفاوضات ولكنه يحرر عبر البندقية، لأن هذا الاحتلال لا يعرف إلا لغة القوة. اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين وأنزل نصرك على عبادك المجاهدين في فلسطين وفي كل مكان. اللهم عليك باليهود والأمريكان الظالمين ومن والاهم.
يؤتى بهم لفيفا إلى فلسطين ليكون الشرف لفلسطين وأهل فلسطين ومن ورائهم أمة الإسلام في القضاء على الشر المستطير لهذه الشرذمة من البشر، مهما كان في الخليقة من وحوش كاسرة، من طيور جارحة، من زواحف مؤذية، من حشرات ضارة، من ميكروبات فتاكة، خطرها أدنى بكثير من خطر اليهود. بعد عدد محدود من السنين سيدرك الجميع من الصهاينة والمستوطنين أن مجيئهم إلى فلسطين كان للمذبحة الكبرى التي يريد الله بها أن يريح البشرية من شرهم. عندما تتحرر فلسطين ويعود إليها أهلها وتكون كل هذه المنطقة قد تحولت بفضل الله ورحمته إلى ما يعني أستبشر أن يكون اسمه الولايات المتحدة الإسلامية، يعني هذه منطقتنا إن شاء الله، وستكون أرض فلسطين هي عاصمة الخلافة الإسلامية، وتكون كل هذه الدول هي ولايات تابعة لدار الخلافة، وبناء عليه عندئذ بإمكان أي شخص يعني من أهل فلسطين أن يقيم في أي منطقة يشاء، لأن أرض الإسلام كلها أرض لكل مسلم إن شاء الله. إلى أن يتحقق ذلك يجب رفض كل مشاريع التوطين أو التجنيس أو حتى التعويض قبل العودة.
دواء.
طيب اسمع يا صديقي، في عندكم يهود؟ صديقي يا قيس.
هسه لا.
طيب انا سمعت هم بيجوا عليكم كل يوم.
بس هسه لا.
طيب اسمع يا صديقي، اعمل ايدك هيك.
مخيم.
لما يجوا عندكم اضربهم بوكس. خلي وجهه بنداره.
ان شاء الله عشان نحرر فلسطين.
ان شاء الله. صديقي. طيب على العموم يا روان، انا بقول له يمسك حجر ولما يجي اليهود عنده يمسكوه وبوم.
طبعا الجيران اليهوديين عادي
يطبش عليهم
لو كانوا يهود، يعني جيرانه او صهاينه عادي. طيب ليش حابه تصيري شرطيه؟ ليش؟ زي مين؟ زي عمه. مين عمه؟ احمد. هو شرطي؟ شو بيسوي طب الشرطي؟
بحبس الحرامي واللي بيعمل مشاكل
وبطخ اليهود، صح؟ انت بدك تصيري زيه؟ ان شاء الله لما تكبري. لما طخ اليهود كلهم؟ كلهم؟ طيب
Atmosphere, the V sign for victory being displayed in East Jerusalem today among jubilant Palestinians that the United States had been subject to this attack. What are we to make of that, Jennifer? Are we to, Yasser Arafat may issue this condemnation. Look at this. We're seeing people applauding, clapping, smiling, happy to know that thousands of Americans have died in this sneak attack. And there you see a V for victory sign held up to the camera. What are we to make of that, and what are we to make of what about what Yasser Arafat said today?
The United States blamed by some Palestinians for its ongoing support, as it is seen, of Israel in this conflict, in this Middle Eastern conflict. However, while some Palestinians were taking to the streets in apparent celebration, one youth was quoted as saying, as he received a sweets handed around in celebration, "This is a sweet from Osama bin Laden," he said.
Back to you. Pat Dawson, thanks very much. We have some videotape, I understand, that we're going to show you from the West Bank. These are Palestinian celebrations in the wake of Tuesday's terror attacks in the United States. Apparently, Palestinians took to the street chanting, "God is great." People were throwing candy, distributing candy to passers-by. The U.S. government obviously has become increasingly unpopular, particularly in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, because Palestinians feel that the U.S. government has sided with Israel. One man, Nawal Abdel Fattah, wearing a long black dress, threw sweets in the air saying, actually that's a woman, pardon me, saying she was happy because, quote, "America is the head of the snake. America always stands by Israel in its war against us." Meanwhile, Yasser Arafat emerged to speak with reporters.
On June 9th, 2006, the news broke. According to Palestinian sources, an Israeli shell had killed 7 people from the same family and wounded 30 at a beach in Gaza. Palestinian sources initially blamed shells from an Israeli gunboat. When the gunboat explanation failed, Palestinians claimed, with the help from a Human Rights Watch specialist,
that the family members were killed by 155mm howitzer shell.
Zakaria Abu Harbid, a cameraman from the Palestinian news agency Ramatan, arrived at the scene about a half an hour later while the last bodies were being removed and filmed approximately 8 minutes of rushes. He later received the 2006 Sony-sponsored Rory Peck Award for hard news reporting. His pictures of a grieving Huda Ghalia went around the world in minutes. Global outrage. Palestinian cries for vengeance.
Revenge, revenge, and destroy Israel, destroy America.
Hamas terminated its Hudna, the ceasefire, and the summer war of 2006 began. This is a classic lethal narrative, a story that inspires pity for the Palestinian victims, incites hatred of brutal Israelis, and calls Palestinian men of honor to violence. But how accurate is this narrative? There is no doubt that these people are dead, and shrapnel Israeli doctors removed from the surviving wounded confirms that they were victims of a blast. But let's examine the scene of the alleged crime. When we look closely at the scene on the beach, there is no evidence of an explosion from an artillery shell. If a 155mm shell had hit the sand, it would have left a huge crater. If it had exploded above ground, it would have flattened everything in a large radius. But in Harbid's on-site footage, we see no crater, and only meters away we have undamaged family possessions still standing. In fact, the Palestinians offered no real evidence to the media, only presenting admittedly non-related shrapnel, and the Human Rights Watch military expert could not sustain his claim of a 155mm shell in direct confrontation with the IDF specialists.
The family members were killed by 155mm howitzer shell.
On the contrary, the evidence strongly suggests a low-intensity explosion in which even the dead bodies were relatively undamaged. This corroborates the findings of the Israeli investigation, which concluded categorically that no Israeli shell was fired in that direction at that time. This conclusion deserves credence. We know that when the evidence of their own investigations indicate Israeli fault, they admit it publicly and apologize for the loss of Arab civilian lives as if it were friendly fire, and treat the injured in their hospitals. In this case, when wounded from the blast came to Israeli hospitals for treatment, the doctors were shocked to discover that Palestinian doctors had hastily removed all the shrapnel they could, at risk to the very lives of the patients involved. Were they eliminating incriminating evidence? Indeed, when Israeli doctors did take out fragments and forensic experts examined them, they established conclusively that the fragments were not from Israeli shells. In other words, the evidence strongly suggests that Hurag Alia's family was not killed by the alleged artillery shell. Could the Palestinians have manipulated this location to tell the story of family day out at the beach, massacred by Israeli shells? In short, could we be dealing with another Pallywood production whose job is to turn any Palestinian tragedy, even one that's their own fault, into an assault on the viewer's emotions to blacken Israel in world opinion? Do Harbid's rushes contain evidence of manipulating the scene to make it photogenic and blame Israel? Why, for example, are these men throwing around the family's belongings? Are they rearranging things that should have been flattened by so powerful a blast? Why is Harbid messing up neatly packed items? Where are the signs of explosion, burn marks, blood among the family's possessions? Huda's brother, Aham, claimed to journalists that the missile landed in the middle of where we were. My father was behind me and I saw his stomach cut open with the intestines hanging out. He died in my arms. But then how did the mortally injured father get from the site of the explosion to sand dunes 20 yards away? And where is the blood on Aham's clothing? But if Israeli shells didn't kill the family, what did? Could it have been one of the numerous mines and booby traps that the Palestinians planned to stop Israeli commando raids landing on the beach? If so, would those who planted the mines not warn their people because to do so would also alert the Israelis? Experience suggests an unhappy answer. Palestinian militants often seem to show little concern for the safety of their own people. For example, on September 23, 2005, Hamas paraded live explosives at a celebration of Israel's evacuation of Gaza. The bombs exploded amidst a group of children, killing 15 and injuring dozens. Hamas tried to blame Israel, but this time the media was present and could not so easily be deceived. In the Gaza Beach case, as with the Jenin massacre, however, the media immediately and unquestioningly accepted the Palestinian accusations.
This report includes graphic content. Viewer discretion is advised.
This girl had been having a picnic with family members when artillery shells fired from an Israeli gunboat off the coast hit the sand.
Let's pursue the working hypothesis in which, as the evidence strongly suggests, this unfortunate family was killed by a Palestinian explosive that was intended for Israeli soldiers. What would this child's grief mean to the viewer in light of our awareness that Palestinians killed her family? In an interview with British journalists, Harbid claimed, "When I arrived at the beach, it was full of dead bodies. I saw Huda Ghalia running between her dead family till she arrived at her father's dead body, crying, 'Father, Father.' She looked at me and shouted loudly, 'Film, film.' At this moment, I recognized what a big humanistic message I am committed to deliver to the whole world with my small camera." Harbid also commented earlier to a German reporter, "She asked me to film her. She wanted to be seen with her father to show the world the crimes of Israel." Would he have made his humanistic message if he had known the Palestinians had killed Huda's family? What would we then think of the exploitation of this girl's grief by the very authorities responsible for her family's death? What would we then think of the manipulation of our emotions by people who seem far less moved by their own grieving Huda than they expect us to feel through our TVs and computer screens? What would the Western media's immediate acceptance of what Palestinian sources told them tell us about their credulity? Their haste in going public with accusations against Israel, their eagerness to package the conflict as the Palestinian David and the Israeli Goliath. And how much do such failures by our news media contribute to the ability of Palestinian leaders to exploit their own victims' grief in order to create hatred? What do we really know about the forces that bring war to this heartrending region of the world?
One prize President Clinton will not take with him when he leaves office in January is peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. He tried, but it just didn't work out. In fact, what's happening over there right now is looking more and more like a war, the latest Arab-Israeli war. The fiercest battles in the Middle East were waged right here at the crossroad, at that army post which is there to protect a settlement which is the focal point of Palestinian rage. In this one tiny area, which Palestinians now call the Martyrs' Junction, more than 30 were killed and hundreds were wounded.
Millions of viewers watch this in-depth news report. Scenes like these of action and injury are broadcast all over the world. Flashed on the screen in dramatic sight bites, presented in a larger storyline, they're a major source of information about the enduring Arab-Israeli conflict. And yet, something is amiss, something that escapes the attention of news editors and viewers alike. Let's examine these images in their original context, the raw footage from which reporters and news editors piece together their stories. Most of the scenes you're about to see were filmed by Palestinian cameramen working independently, employed and equipped by Western news agencies at Netzarim Junction in the Gaza Strip on September 30th, 2000. The Israeli police station is here. The Palestinian here. Next to the Israeli position, there's a factory, twice as tall as the Israeli post. Behind are two residential towers known as the Twins. Palestinian and Israeli policemen had been doing joint patrols as stipulated in the Oslo Accords. On this day, angry crowds with stones and Molotov cocktails gathered at the junction, attacked the Israeli outpost, and were joined by Palestinian police firing their guns. This scene, apparently of a Palestinian man shot by Israelis and evacuated in an ambulance, was captured by a Palestinian cameraman working for French public television, Channel 2. A shot rings out. The man falls to the ground, clutching his right leg. The ambulance pulls up in seconds. Fortunately, we can see the scene caught from a different angle by another Palestinian cameraman working for a major news agency. We see three men, apparently under fire, drag the wounded man roughly across the pavement toward the back of the ambulance. But if they were under fire, why did the ambulance stop so far short of the man, forcing the others to drag him back, rather than move forward and protect him from the fire? And if he were injured, is this a way to evacuate an injured man? But wait, he was supposedly hit on the right side of the right leg, presumably by a bullet. And yet, as they load him on the stretcher, we see no trace of blood on that side of his right leg, and then the medics load him on the supposedly injured leg, without sign of protest from the casualty himself. Could this scene have been staged? Could the immediate appearance of the ambulance have come on cue? This case is not clear. It could be real, it could be staged. The media, however, assumed it was real and made it news.
15 heures, tout vient de basculer près de l'implantation de Netzarim dans la bande de Gaza.
Let us consider another battle scene filmed that day, or possibly the day after. A Palestinian gunman fires into a hole in the wall. It looks like a tense moment of house-to-house fighting. We would assume he's firing at the Israelis. He is firing in their direction, but he can't be firing at them. Here he is, on the far side of the factory building, completely out of range of the Israeli position. Are Israeli soldiers inside the factory? All witnesses concur. They never left their fortified position. Earlier footage gives us a look inside the hole in the wall. The street fighter is conversing with his comrades inside the room he will soon be spraying with gunfire. A large crowd, mostly civilians, and a few men in military garb, mills around as Palestinian soldiers climb in and out of the hole in the wall. Note the civilians giving orders to a military man. Does this look like a war zone? Orders come to clear the area. Military men line up as if they're taking cover, but from what? Not Israeli bullets. And now, the street fighter runs up to the hole in the wall and fires into the empty room. The raw footage clearly indicates a staged scene. A sight bite became news. Consider a third scene. This funeral procession was filmed by an Israeli reconnaissance drone in the aftermath of a military operation in Jenin in April 2002. Palestinian sources claim that the Israelis had massacred hundreds of civilians and that they had to bury their dead. In this particular case, the men accidentally tipped the funeral bier, dropping the corpse. When they regroup, the corpse climbs back on the bier. Later, a crowd has joined the procession. The pallbearers drop the man again. The crowd scatters, frightened perhaps at seeing the dead man stir with life. But the pallbearers regroup, the corpse climbs forthrightly on the bier. And once again, they wrap him in the winding sheet. Welcome to Pallywood. Pallywood is a bustling industry of alfresco cinema, stage news filmed in real time against a backdrop of a complex conflict we all think we know. It has directors, makeup men, sets, extras, often playing dead or injured, props, especially ambulances, plenty of cameramen,
and sometimes large audiences. Pallywood operates according to a few basic sequences. One person fakes or exaggerates an injury and attracts a crowd, drawn from the ready and willing onlookers eager to gather at the slightest provocation. Someone waves or whistles, and an ambulance appears as if on cue. Frantic men grab the casualty, sometimes causing further injury, and load him into the ambulance. The hallmarks of Pallywood are casualties that look more like football players acting for the referee than real injuries, ever-ready ambulances, and rough evacuations that would cripple or kill a truly wounded victim. Why so rough? Those evacuating the wounded seem to be in a panic. But why? Presumably they're under Israeli fire. They certainly act as if they are. But if that were the case, wouldn't they carry the injured away from the Israeli post? Here a group of youths runs with an apparently injured boy away from the Israelis. But when they get to the other side of the highway, an adult grabs the boy from the youths and runs him back to an ambulance waiting right in front of the Israeli post, where people stand around, apparently unafraid of Israeli guns. Consider yet another scene. This young man runs across the road away from the Israelis, carrying what looks like a Molotov cocktail. He hands it off. A red stain on his forehead looks like blood, but his movements betray no sign of injury. He runs into a crowd where he becomes a casualty of war. Note that although he should look like someone with a head injury, he sits firmly, his head held high as the crowd carries him. Note also the France 2 cameraman catching the dramatic sight bite. But now what are they doing? This group rushes him back directly in front of the Israeli post. Here people cluster around, backs to the Israeli guns without the slightest sign of concern, even though they have just evacuated what was presumably a victim of Israeli fire. Are these people in a war zone or on a movie set? This upside-down Pallywood logic is one of the great revelations of the raw footage. When they are not acting, even in the same scenes with the actors, Palestinians show no fear of Israeli guns. We can locate two main areas of action. An outdoor studio, well out of reach of the Israeli position, which is the staging area for battle scenes. Here, fighters and civilians run for cover, hit the ground, duck from virtual gunfire. Another staging area, directly in range of the Israeli post, is the preferred site for filming ambulance evacuations. While some boys throw rocks, others stand around nonchalantly and enjoy the show. Here they shoot most of the ambulance evacuation scenes, apparently untroubled by the possibility that the Israeli post directly behind them might compromise the credibility of their staged scenes. Cars, taxis, and trucks pass through the intersection. A family strolls by. Cameramen and assistants stand with their backs to the Israelis as an ambulance goes by. Our hot-headed actors seem to be reacting to stage directions, not to reality. What is the reality? It's sometimes difficult to separate truth from fiction. The gunfire here is real, but the cameraman is far away, behind the factory, shooting other battle sequences with no Israeli in sight. This scene seems somewhat convincing. Real gunfire, certainly, but real danger? Not from Israelis. The cameraman is now moving north, away from the junction, the factory behind him. A man is lying in the gutter. Is he ducking for cover?
Injured? Why is he lying down? Is the reception better? Hollywood employs cameramen in the field and journalists who cook stories of Israeli cruelty. Ali Smodi briefs his cameramen as they drive to an assignment. It's a classic.
إنه يخليني أولد ولادة طبيعية. هو الظلم الإسرائيلي اللي منعني إني أولد كولادة طبيعية من حق أي امرأة فلسطينية كانت ولا أجنبية كانت إنها تولد ولادة طبيعية على سرير في مستشفى.
شغلت السيارة من هون نلاقي الأمبولانس في قباطي. نعم. على تقريبا 12:03. هسه من 12:03 بين مسافة من جنين لقباطي بتستعملش 5 دقائق. الأمبولانس قعد حوالي ربع ساعة اللي هو تأخير الجيش على الحاجز.
يعني الجيش كان في حواجز؟
في حاجز اللي هي على منطقة جنات هون مضرة على جنات. وفي هاي الفترة الولد أنا أجل المخاض لزوجتي وأنا اللي ولدتها وقمت بعملية الولادة كلياتها أنا.
طيب
رغم إني أنا بعرفش بهذا الحكي.
أنت اللي كنت سائق؟
أنا اللي كنت سائق.
But we know the woman gave birth in the hospital, and the journalist had already spoken with the doctor who delivered the infant.
أحكي مع الدكتور. خليهم الله يخليكم. أنت اللي ولدتها؟ أنت اللي ولدتها؟ لا يعني هسه أنت اللي
Here, the doctor who delivered the baby coaches the father.
حسيت حالك انك يعني خايف محرج كيف شعورك يعني هيك الوضع اللي كان يعني كيف الوضع اللي كنت فيه لما باللحظه انه ويلك الولد بده يطلع ويلك الام وانت ما عندكش خلفيه وفيش معك حدا يساعدك اصلا فيش معك حدا لحاله بالسياره انت لحالك بالسياره
زوجتي لحالنا فيش ولا
بالضبط كيف شعورك كيف بدك تطلع الولد طب الولد طلع زوجتك بتصيح انه ولدت.
Palestinian journalists and cameramen are not alone in shaping the news.
Le deuxième jour, le 4, à 2h du matin, l'hôpital a été frappé par 11 obus de char.
11 obus de char?
Ouais.
Donc en fait, ils ont véritablement visé l'hôpital.
C'est sûr, je suis certain.
C'était
Ah
pas,
oui.
c'est pas un obus, c'est une erreur, mais 12.
Ouais. Je vous dis, les traces, elles sont jusqu'à maintenant. Hein.
C'est vrai?
Ouais, ouais.
On pourra filmer les...
Oui, vous pouvez filmer les traces.
Les traces.
Ah ouais. Regardez là, l'escalier là en bas, il y a une place.
On voit un trou, oui.
Oui, un trou là-bas.
C'est les obus alors?
Oui, et là aussi, c'est des obus, mais c'est des obus antipersonnels.
We know exactly what the building looks like when a tank shoots at it.
Hollywood Productions affirmed the repeated claims of Palestinian spokesmen. The soldiers of the occupation army constantly, deliberately, maliciously make life miserable for their innocent victims.
Vous ne voulez pas que les gens reçoivent le traitement nécessaire et adéquat. Même pas, on a tout distribué, on n'a même pas de quoi manger.
ما شو رسالة بعد بروكين أنا مأشر زي كل ما شو رسالة كاخر أنا مأشر زي وأنا بقول لك فهمه شو ما بدي يأخذ عوادي بروكين.
Hollywood is a public secret on its home ground. The audience enjoys the staged show here right in front of the Israeli position. Sometimes the set needs to be cleared of an audience before the scene can be shot. Hollywood elicits applause and smiles of satisfaction for a good performance. And Hollywood works. International news media extract a few convincing instances of these stage scenes and present them as news.
In this one tiny area, which Palestinians now call the Martyrs' Junction, more than 30 were killed and hundreds...
Not even the Palestinians claimed anything like that figure at the time. Here the New York Times, October 1st, 2000, reports 3 dead the day before at Netzarim. As we shall see,
2 of those turned out to be unsubstantiated. Pallywood, it seems, has the power not only to convince and influence an unsuspecting public, but also to enlist the best journalists, perhaps out of naivete, in its casualty production and inflation.
More than 30 were killed and hundreds were wounded. In modern warfare, one picture can be worth 1,000 weapons.
And that's what Pallywood is all about.
إنما جاءهم من قلوبهم الضعيفة لأنهم جبناء لما قتل من قتل أمام أعينهم دب الرعب في قلوبهم، بدأوا يخربون بيوتهم. والآن الإعلام يقول بأنهم سيخرجوا من المستوطنات. نعم، سيخرجوا من غزة، سيخرجوا صاغرين بإذن الله تعالى، سيخرجوا مهزومين شاءوا أم أبوا أمام هذا النصر العظيم.
لو أن اليهود تركوا لنا فلسطين خلاص يبقوا حبايبنا؟ لا طبعا، عمرهم ما هيبقوا حبايبنا اطلاقا. عقيدتك في اليهود 1 انهم كفار، 2 انهم اعداء. مش اعداء عشان يحتلوا فلسطين، وانما هم اعداء ولو لم يحتلوا شيئا. عقيدتك في اليهود انهم سنقاتلهم وسنهزمهم وسنستأصل شأفتهم، فلا يعود على ظهر الأرض يهودي واحد. ليس لأنني أقول ذلك، بل هي البشارة. لن تقوم الساعة حتى تقاتلوا اليهود فتقتلونهم ولو اختبأ اليهودي، ده رواية أخرى من رواية الحديث، خلف حجر أو شجر، نادى الحجر والشجر: يا مسلم، يا عبد الله، هذا يهودي ورائي فتعال فاقتل. ألا بقاء لأشكالكم ما بقي أحدنا. أيا يهود، ألا لعنة الله عليكم. أيا يهود، اللهم أنزل عليهم سخطك ورجزك وعذابك. اللهم إنا نسألك أن تعيد مسخهم لتقر أعين المسلمين برؤيتهم قردة وخنازير. أيا خنازير الأرض، أيا خنازير الأرض، أيا خنازير الأرض.